Hello, today I will be reading Chapter 2 of Takeout by Margaret Maron. Near the lower end of 6th Avenue, on a corner where the windowless side of one building pulls back 8 feet farther from the other, an opportunistic sycamore tree shelters a long metal park bench anchored in cement. The space isn't big enough to be called a park. No grass, no flowers, but it's a shady place to sit in the summer, and with cardboard scraps to cover its slats in winter, the bench makes a warmer bed than the icy sidewalk, sheltered as it is on two sides by brick walls. Despite the city's periodic efforts to rid the homeless from its streets, the bench does seem to invite them. The nearest bus stop is a block away, and the storefronts on either side of the street are not for browsing, but strictly utilitarian: an electrician, a shoe repair, a locksmith, and a dry cleaner's. Locals seldom use the bench, and they don't complain about the street people who do. Live and let live. Except when they don't. That mild June morning, a patrol car on the beat stopped at the corner. When the officer got out to prod the sleeping derelict onto his feet, he discovered that the man was dead, with no obvious sign of violence. This was not a first for the young officer, nor even a second. Living on the streets too often meant dying on the streets. Too much rot gut whiskey, too many drugs, or an untreated medical condition. Who knew? Not his problem. Ordinarily, he would have called it in, waited for the wagon to come take the body off his hands, made a note of it in his daily report, and that would have been that. What made this death different was finding a second body under a dingy comforter at the far end of the bench. "I thought it was the first guy's belongings," the officer told Lieutenant Sigrid Harold when the homicide team arrived. He pointed to the takeout cartons strewn under the bench, where ants in yellow jackets were busy with the food scraps. A crumpled bag bore the logo of a nearby Italian restaurant. It's like he had supper and then slumped down against the armrest and went to sleep. But then when I saw the other one, and he was bleeding too. Sigurd watched the M.E. swap identical thin trickles of blood that had oozed from the mouths of the dead men. Both were white, and both wore jeans and knit shirts. The first man was at least 70. His white hair was worn in an abbreviated ponytail secured by a blue rubber band. His short white Santa Claus beard looked hand-trimmed. His green, long-sleeved cotton t-shirt was marginally newer than the faded gray shirt of his companion in death, and he wore thick leather sandals without socks, while the other man had on ragged sneakers. The younger man's graying hair was close-cropped, and he appeared to be in his early 50s, but he had the sunken cheeks and ashy skin of an addict, so he could have been much younger. His immediate examination finished, Dr. Cohn stood and indicated that the detectives could begin searching the bodies. "Overdose?" Sigurd asked him. The M.E. shrugged. "The younger guy's got the physical signs of a crystal meth user, but the other one, he's got a pacemaker. No sign of meth, and no tracks on his arms." Time of death for both of them was probably sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. "Food poisoning?" she asked. "Botulism or ptomany?" He cast a doubtful eye over the two bodies. "Won't know till I open them up. No vomit, though, and it does look as if they had a good final meal. If that goose pony bag means anything, I'm not ready to call it a homicide, but it sure as hell would be a real coincidence if their deaths were natural. Not with that blood. I'll take samples, but you know how long it takes to run a tox screen if it's not something common." To be on the safe side, Sigurd sent several officers to canvass shops and houses in the immediate area, then walked over to Detective Elaine Elby, an attractive blonde in her early 30s, just as Elby pulled a roll of 50s and 20s from the older man's pocket. 480, Elby said as she finished counting and slid the money into an evidence bag. No ID? Sorry, Lieutenant. Just a Duane Reed receipt from 2 days ago. The one on 9th and 43rd for a bottle of aspirins. 3 subway tokens, a 5, 2 ones, and some change in that other pocket. Nothing else except these 2 keys. The keys could have been for an apartment door, but there were no identifying names or numbers. The small bills were separate from the large ones, asked Detective Tilden, glancing over at Elby's findings. He had turned out the pockets of the younger man. No ID, but he'd found a flyer for a soup kitchen 2 blocks down. A small nondescript switchblade with a bone handle, a $20 bill, and a handful of change. 480 in that guy's pocket and a 20 here? You suppose that bankroll started out at an even 500? A few years older than Elby and Lowry, Tilly was Sigurd's most trusted team member, even though he occasionally tried her patience with his excessively detailed reports. Nothing was too small to escape his attention. You're suggesting our first man shared his wealth? She asked dubiously. Why? Tilly had no answer to that. In the meantime, Alby's partner, Detective Jim Lowry, had finished with the grocery cart parked behind the bench. It held an umbrella, a half-used roll of paper towels, a box of crackers, and some articles of clothing, but nothing to identify the owner. Probably belonged to the meth head, Lowry said, since he's the one with the blanket. When their crime scene photographer had taken several instant pictures of the men's faces, Tilly said, Want us to go talk to the staff at the soup kitchen? See if they knew one of these guys? Sigurd nodded, and Tilly signaled to Reuben Gonzalez, one of the newer detectives, as a uniformed officer rounded the corner and approached them. Holding on to his arm for support was an elderly white-haired woman who barely topped his elbow, and who seemed to move with difficulty. A small group of curious pedestrians had collected behind the yellow tape that marked off the bench. When asked, none volunteered knowledge of the dead man. I'm ashamed to say I never look at street people very closely, said one woman. Don't beat yourself up, said her friend. What can one person do? It's the city's problem, and City Hall keeps shifting the blame for why we don't have more homeless shelters. Lieutenant, the officer called, this lady may know one of them. Sigurd motioned them forward. This is Miss Orlando, he said. She lives just down the block. A guy in the diner says he's seen her come this way with takeout pretty regularly, and her employer said she came last night. Until then, Sigurd had not paid attention to their precise location. Now she looked more closely at the direction from which Miss Orlando had come and recognized the diner where she and Elliot Buntrock had eaten supper with Rudy Gottfried last week. And unless she was mistaken, this was the same woman who had entered the house across the street, the house where Rudy said the mafia widow lived. Seen up close, the old woman had a small wrinkled face overshadowed by thick eyebrows of coarse, wiry gray hair that almost met over the bridge of her nose. She ignored Sigurd's outstretched hand and shuffled straight over to the bodies still on the bench. Alby pulled back the paper sheets that covered them. She stood gazing at the first one for so long that Alby gently touched her arm. Did you know him? That one I see many times, she said with a distinct Italian accent. She gave the older man a curious glance. Him? Never. But you brought the other man food? Sigurd asked. Those bushy eyebrows drew together over a frown, and she spoke with obvious reluctance. Not just him. Most places give too much food for two old women, and when there are leftovers we give to the hungry. If no one is here, I leave it on the bench. Someone always takes it. Both of them open Both of the open foam cartons on the ground under the benches bore smears of Alfredo sauce, white cheese, and scraps of pasta. But the one under the meth addict seemed to have less of the red sauce than the box lying closer to the other body. Miss Orlando pointed to the first box. That was ours. Fettuccine Alfredo, not the lasagna. Did you eat any of my fettuccine? The woman nodded. And my signora, too. You brought it in that Giuseppine bag? Yes. What time did you come? About 8:30, before dark. But you knew this one? Sigurd asked, pointing to the speed addict. Not to know, the woman said, just to see. Just to know he was sometimes here. So when did you last see him? From farther up the block, a fire engine pulled out into the street with lights flashing and the siren blasting. So Sigurd had to repeat the question. Miss Orlando beetled her thick gray eyebrows, then shrugged. Last week. We had Chinese that day, and my signora sent me with the egg rolls we did not eat. Matty, she broke off in sudden consternation. Who's Matty? The lieutenant asked. One of the bums that's sometimes here. Sigurd fixed her with skeptical gray eyes. You sure it's not one of these men? Miss Orlando dropped her own eyes. You might as well tell us the truth, Miss Orlando. I have a feeling we'll find out anyhow as soon as we run his fingerprints. The older woman sighed and gestured to the younger man. He's Matty Mouton. And how do you know him? His mother was a good friend to my signora. He turned into a bum. Broke her heart before she died. In a mixture of sadness and scorn, she told them how her employer, a Miss Benito Del Vico, had tried to help the young man break free of drugs, but after his last failure, she washed her hands of him and forbade him to come to her house again. She does not talk to him, and she does not give him money, but every week, for his mother's sake, she pretends she's very hungry, and then there is too much food to throw away, so I bring it to this bench. Every Tuesday. Usually he's here, sometimes not. But not last night? No. With lips clamped tight, she turned to go, and would have fallen had Sigurd not reached out to steady her. She signaled to the young uniformed officer who had escorted the old woman here. Officer, she looked at the man's name tag. Officer James, please see that Miss Orlando gets home safely. Yes, ma'am, he said, offering his arm. I can walk, she snapped. I'm no cripple yet. I'm sure you can manage on your own, he said cheerfully. But this sidewalk's uneven, and if you fall, they'll have my scalp. So please, ma'am. Still grumbling, she took his arm, and they moved slowly back down the block. U.S. Bean Di Napoli was a popular neighborhood restaurant, and when questioned by detectives Albie and Lowry, the manager rolled his eyes. Lasagna. Do you know how many of our customers order that? And half of them take some home with them. Before he thumbed through the receipts from the night before, 12 lasagnas served on site and 4 takeouts, 2 of those on credit cards, 5 servings of fettuccine, no takeouts, and nobody got sick either, he added defensively. Within the hour, Sigurd's team had names and addresses for the 2 who had used credit cards. One was a woman who lived 2 blocks over on Prince Street. The other lived half a block up on 6th. For once they got lucky. Both customers were home, and both still had their takeout boxes. The woman's was in her garbage pail, The elderly man's was in his refrigerator. One order of just beans lasagna lasts me 3 meals, he told them. They came up empty on the neighborhood canvas, but Sigurd gave orders for officers to come back after 5 to try finding people who were not at home now. Albie, you and Laurie stop by the restaurant later and see if any of last night's waiters can remember who took lasagna or fettuccine home with them. Martha's Table was the name of the nearby soup kitchen. Its motto was works, not words, a sly poke at those sisters in the Gospel of Luke. 2 volunteers immediately recognized the instant picture of Mattie Mouton that Gonzalez had showed them. The other victim's picture drew only shrugs and head shakes. But yeah, poor Mattie was one of our regulars. Friendly kid, said the woman who was probably no more than 40. Kid? The woman laughed as she dumped a gallon can of string beans into a serving tray on the steam table. Although the place wouldn't open for at least another hour, a savory odor of beef stew wafted through the large room, and people were already lining up on the sidewalk outside. He was like a puppy, eager to please. You didn't know him from the old days, said the other volunteer, a small black man with a shiny bald head who was stacking loaves of 2-day-old bread at the end of the counter. When I first came here a few years ago, he'd showed up every once in a while. He was heavy into meth, twitchy eyes, quick to mouth off about how he was connected, like anybody believed that. But then he went into rehab, cleaned up his act, got a job, even volunteered here once in a while. Yeah? Said the woman. I didn't know that. He crashed and burned a few months ago, said the man as he finished stacking the loaves with the precision of a bricklayer. Right before Christmas, he went back to using again. Yo-yoed back and forth between wanting to punch somebody out and crying for how things had gone so wrong. Matty, come on. He never punched anybody out, the woman objected. He was a puppy dog. One that'd been kicked too many times, said the man. He sighed. Yeah, he was one beat-down little puppy. Who were his friends here? Asked Gonzalez. Friends? They shrugged. He was pretty much a loner. On the likely chance that this was indeed a homicide, Sigurd signaled to Tilly and they walked down the side street past Rudy Gottfried's basement apartment to number 409, a well-maintained private home. It was period federal style on the outside, but when Miss Orlando answered the door and showed them into the living room, Sigurd was instantly reminded of her grandmother Lattimore's early 20th century home down in North Carolina. Polished mahogany chests and tables held tasteful keepsakes. The chairs were upholstered in harmonizing colors, and oriental rugs lay on the hardwood floors. All bought with mob money, thought Sigurd. Like Sigurd's grandmother, Ms. Delvico's wrinkled face held traces of youthful beauty. A tall woman with fair skin and the clear blue eyes of northern Italy, she did not rise when they entered and was clearly accustomed to difference. Seated in a high-backed wing chair like a contessa on a throne, she did not smile in welcome. No sooner had Miss Orlando announced them than she waved aside Sigurd's ID and fixed her with a cold and arrogant eye. Before Sigurd could express sympathy, the woman gestured for them to be seated. Orla has already told me. Where will they take the boy's body, and when will it be released? Are you Mr. Moton's next of kin? There was a further tightening of those thin lips. I will be responsible for his burial. We'll still need his next of kin. There is no other next of kin. Only me, his godmother. When did you last see him?" Ms. Delvicho frowned and glanced at the woman who seemed as much her companion as her housekeeper. "In February. He came here talking crazy, begging me for money. I told him no more, not a penny." "What about you yourself, Miss Orlando?" "Yesterday. I went to the bakery up on Houston Street, and he was sitting on a bench there, so I gave him a muffin when I came out. And last night, I told you, I left fettuccine on the bench." "Where did he live?" "On the street. That grocery cart. Everything he owned was in it." "It was his choice," said Miss Delvicho. "He—" She paused at the sound of a key turning in the outer door, and they watched as a heavy-set, middle-aged man let himself into the foyer. He was just under 6 feet tall. His broad, flat face was pitted with old acne scars. Without removing his sunglasses, he let the door slam behind him, and he lumbered into the room. "Sophia, I came as fast as I could. A fender bender had traffic on the bridge backed up. Are you all right?" He bent over the seated Miss Delvicho and kissed the thin cheek she offered him. "Now that you are here, yes," she said. "These are police officers, George." His glasses finished turning from dark to clear as he straightened to face them, and behind the lenses his brown eyes widened. "Lieutenant Harold, isn't it?" "I'm sorry," Sigrid said, rising from her chair. "Have we met?" "Only informally." He held out his hand. "George Edwards. It was at that god-awful opening for one of Hall de Pietro's artists, last spring, right before he was killed. Didn't you handle that investigation?" Sigurd nodded. "You're an attorney, aren't you?" "Yes. Sophia, Miss Delvicho, called me as soon as she heard that Matty was found dead next to another body. Something about the fettuccine Orla took him. We don't have a cause of death yet, Mr. Edwards. We're just here to learn more about him. Do you know any of his friends, where he lived?" "No. I helped him get back into rehab 2 or 3 years ago. When he came out, we got him a room over on West Summer Street, but he gave it up when he started using again. Would rather spend the money on drugs than a bed." Edwards gave them the name of the facility. They might know something. They were supposed to do follow-ups. Miss Delvicho gave an impatient wave of her hand. "If there are no further questions for my clients—" "Just one for now," said Sigrid. "Miss Orlando, you said that others leave food on that bench too." "Who?" "Different ones," the housekeeper replied. "The Red Door woman most often, and sometimes the boy from the diner. Maybe others from the street. I do not keep watch." They stood to go, and George Edwards showed them out. At the door he handed Sigrid his card. "If you need to speak to them again, please call me first." Back outside, Tilly spotted a red door at the opposite end of the street. There was no professional signage on the front of the otherwise nondescript 3-story building, but steps led down to the basement, and a homemade board wired to the iron handrail announced that jazz played there nightly from 8:30 till 2, Wednesday through Saturday. They crossed, rang the brass bell, and were answered by a tall, loose-jointed woman who wore her brown hair in a single side braid across her shoulder. She cocked her head in amusement. "You're not plumbers, are you?" When they showed her their badges and introduced themselves, the woman frowned. "Somebody complained again?" "Complained?" Sigurd asked. "Complained about what?" "Oh, people are always complaining about something," the woman said smoothly, leaning against the door frame. She wore a red shirt and white capris, and the toenails of her bare feet were painted a pale green. "And you are—" "Janice Jennings. How can I help you?" "We're in investigating two deaths at the end of this block down on 6. Oh, is that why all the police cars and people are down there? I was wondering who died. We don't we don't have a full identification on both men yet, so maybe you can help us, Miss Jennings, Sigurd said. Ms. Jennings, the woman corrected cheerfully. Just don't ask me where Mr. Jennings is. Haven't seen him in 4 years. He went down to the diner for coffee one morning and never came back. Did you file a missing persons report? Tilly asked. Miss Jennings hooted with laughter, and her braid bobbed up and down against her red shirt. God, no. Good riddance. He took his clothes and our dog and cleaned out our bank account. I wouldn't mind having the dog back, though. She was good company. Tilly handed her the pictures of the two dead men. Do you know either of these men? Never saw this guy, she said of the older man. Her face fell at the second picture. Aw, poor Matty. Oh, geez, that's too bad. Did he finally overdose? You know him? Know who he is. He's been hanging around the neighborhood ever since I got here. Likes to brag about being connected to the mafia guy who used to live over there. She pointed down the block to number 409, the Del Vico house. Said he was a nephew or something. Said he was keeping an eye on the guy's widow, protecting her. Protecting her from what? Asked Tilly. Miss Jennings shrugged. Who knows? I thought it was all in his head till somebody at the diner told me that some mafia guy was gunned down right in front of his house there. I felt sorry for Matty, gave him a couple of freebies. Freebies? Asked Sigrid. You know, a free meal, a couple of dollars. Did you ever take food to him? If I saw him down at that bench when I came up from the subway, she grinned. He told me his aunt didn't like him hanging around, so if he was there when I was passing, I'd give him my doggy bag if I had one. A few bucks now and then. I take it you don't care for Miss Delvico? Said Sigrid. I don't care for hypocrites. That house wasn't bought with clean money, was it? Drugs, too, probably. Yet she could turn up her nose at poor Matty and complain about you? Sigurd asked when the woman changed her mind about whatever it was that she started to say. Me and anybody else on the block that annoyed her. If we left our trash barrels out at the curb too long, if we were having a party or the jazz club got too loud on us on a Saturday night. You didn't happen to see him last night, did you? The woman shook her head. A plumber's van pulled up to the curb. The man behind the wheel rolled down his window and called, Jennings? You got it, honey, she said happily. Sorry, Lieutenant, but there's a leak in my washer line. On their way back to the park bench, while Tilly stopped to ask questions at the diner, Sigurd crossed over to Gottfried's apartment, but the artist did not respond to the doorbell. By now the bodies had been removed and the beat officer who had called it in was rolling up the yellow tape. The foam food cartons had been bagged and tagged, and there was nothing left except Matty Mouton's grocery cart. Might as well bring that in, too, Sigurd said, and get the other guy's clothes from the M.E., Albie. Maybe you missed something the first time. Before heading back to her office, she left orders for the officers who had come back to canvass the neighborhood a second time to see if they could learn who had brought lasagna to that park bench. And that is the end of Chapter 2. I will see you all. Well, I won't see you, but hope you get to listen in at tomorrow. Hope you get to listen in tomorrow at 5 for Chapter 3 of Takeout by Margaret Maron. Have a good day.